Hello, welcome to this short presentation on empirical data for introductory research methods for business and education. Today we'll be looking at what empirical data is, the types of data, and the sources of empirical data. First off, what is it? Well, stated simply, it's verifiable objective evidence that can be observed or measured. That's to say, it exists. This makes it distinct from opinion, intuition, or theory alone. It can be generated from things like observation and experimentation, and it can be seen by multiple researchers. Um, there are said to be two main types that we think about in this course, primary or secondary, and I will have another slide on that shortly. Either primary or secondary types of empirical data can be qualitative or quantitative, and either are derived from various data collection methods, which we'll touch on also. So first off, the types of empirical data. Primary or secondary. We say empirical data is either primary or secondary in nature, depending on its origin. Primary means it's original new data collected by the researcher. This means that the researcher has developed a data collection protocol, or perhaps a data collection instrument such as a survey that they will deploy and collect data for purposes of answering their unique research question in their unique study. On the other hand, secondary means that the data is already there. It's been previously collected by others. So there's no need for the researcher to actually design an instrument, for example, such as a survey. The data exists. The researcher thinks it's appropriate to analyze in order to answer their research question. Either primary or secondary data can be qualitative, which means represented in words, or quantitative, which is numerical data. So where do these data come from? Primary data, as just stated, are collected firsthand for subsequent analysis to find solutions to the problem, and they are collected by the researcher using a data collection method. This image here lists several of those methods. Observation, which can collect numerical as well as qualitative data. For example, you could count the number of times that an employee does something. The interview method can collect words or numerical data depending on the questions that you ask. Questionnaires, surveys, the same. You can have open-ended questions that are analyzed thematically because they're answered in words. And you can also have numerical data, such as a Likert scale question. And we'll talk more about Likert scales and other scales in the course. Focus group discussions, photography and video, images can also be considered primary data. Case studies, stories of change, narrative analysis of people's experiences, for example. And there are even other methods. Say you're an archaeology major, you may be unearthing pottery as a new source of primary data. That sounds exciting. In any case, these are data collection methods that researchers use to collect primary data to answer their research question. On the other hand, secondary data are data that already exist and do not have to be collected by the researcher. And they also have two distinct types. They can be internal, such as exit interviews from HR, quality control recordings of customer interactions, medical charts. The point being that they exist within the organization that you're doing or conducting the research in. They can be external data as well, secondary data. And again, it all depends on your problem that you're researching. But examples of these are government databases such as the Census Bureau, the National Bureau of Economic Research. I work for the University of Michigan, where we do a lot of federally funded studies, and we generate databases that are available for public analysis. If you're doing something with online marketing, you might be interested in analyzing website traffic statistics. But the point being, generally, there are internal or external sources of secondary data. And then finally, there's literature, which spans both. Your organization may have internal literature that's appropriate to analyze to answer your question, or it can be external literature created by others that have run their own empirical studies. And that is a common source that's used in the course. And typically, if that is used as your written proposal methodology, you would be employing what's called a systematic literature review strategy. And this is simply something that is designed to locate, appraise, and synthesize the best available evidence relating to a specific research question to provide informative and evidence-based answers. And in that case, it's a strategy just like the others. The purpose is the same. You're examining existing empirical studies to try and answer your research question. However, the means in which you locate them is disciplined, meaning it needs to be well defined and transparent. And that is the process that's used and documented in your study. And the analysis, of course, as before, varies depending on the study purpose and approach and can be either qualitative or quantitative. One thing to point out is that the SLR as a research strategy, while rigorous, avoids primary data collection. However, that's not the primary purpose of an SLR. Typically, they are employed as a strategy because there already is a wealth, perhaps too much, empirical literature on the problem area under study. And then the problem becomes making sense of all that literature. So that is what is meant by the synthesis of literature or empirical studies. And in summary, if you choose to do that, you will need to decide. You will need to decide if you wish to do that, which of these three methods really you will want to do. Primary data collection, secondary data analysis, or a systematic literature review. Empirical data, again, as a summary, is collected by observation, experiment, or measurable data collection methods. So literature will document these if they are collecting empirical data. And two, you need to decide whether you will create your data via primary data collection methods, similar to what I mentioned earlier, the survey, the questionnaire, observation, or whether you will use secondary and existing sources for your research proposal. And then third, you can also choose to use literature and only literature as a secondary source to answer your research questions. If you do decide to do that, you will be using a systematic literature review research strategy, and you will be analyzing empirical literature. Thanks for your attention. I hope this was helpful. And then if you are interested in learning more about the things that were talked about in this presentation, feel free to check out these additional sources. Thanks for your attention again. Bye-bye.